Today's headline is A New Boarder Causes Trouble. The subheadline says, She landed among male boarders, and the results were astonishing. It says, the new boarder was a woman. The landlady told them about her the evening before she came. Every man looked up from his plate and frowned forbiddingly when the news of the contemplated feminine invasion of their sacredly masculine precinct was sprung on them, and every man likewise seemed to be strongly disposed to resent the intrusion in terms that would brook no contradiction. Before committing themselves, however, they looked at the doctor to see how he would take it. The doctor was regarded by tacit agreement as chief sachem of the tribe of bachelors at 465, not only by virtue of his position at the end of the table, but also of his 55 years of experience in the ways of the world and his general knowledge, which was universally conceded to have been gleaned in a broader school than that from which any of the others had matriculated. The doctor himself was not slow to measure the dizzy height to which he had ascended in their estimation, and he never lost an opportunity to make the most of his prestige. When the subject of the new boarder was broached, and the opinion of the 9 other gentlemen and that of the landlady in the bargain was hanging in the balance, ready to be swayed this way or that by a mere breath of the doctor, that individual slowly pondered the weighty matter in silence, and was strangely deliberate in making up his mind. The landlady watched him with ever-growing trepidation. I didn't know how you take it, she said in self-justification, construing his silence as a harbinger of a bitter rebuke for daring to invest in a petticoated boarder. Times are hard, you know, and rooms don't go off like hotcakes nowadays, especially back parlors. Somehow people never seem to take kindly to a back parlor. I don't know why. I'm sure mine has been vacant now for, let's see, more than 3 months. I've advertised and advertised. Scores of people have been in here to look at it, but nobody seemed to want it. This lady, however, was pleased with it, and as every little helps, I'll let her have it. I hope you won't object. If you do, just say so, and I'll notify her in the morning that she can't come. You've all been with me for more than a year, and I wouldn't offend any of you for twice $10 a week, but I am sure you'll find her very nice. The last consolatory remark was a softly feathered arrow that shot its way up and down the table and finally landed in the doctor's conscience. The doctor nibbled at a celery stalk and looked philosophical. We understand the case, Mrs. Haddock, he said, glancing around at the rest of the company and taking it upon himself to answer for the whole household. Of course we can't blame you for running the back parlor, and of course we cannot reasonably object to the presence of a woman, although I believe we have all expressed ourselves more than once to the contrary on that point, and have made it pretty clear that it would be decidedly unpleasant to have any female around except yourself. Now haven't we, Mrs. Haddock? Mrs. Haddock blushed and signified her belief that they had. But for all that, we do not blame you, the doctor continued, and if the new boarder is not a simpering, giggling idiot who will make herself generally obtrusive and unwelcome, why let her come? We certainly can have no objections. The 9 other gentlemen sighed resignedly, and the landlady smiled. You were very kind, she said, with a sprightly nod of her brown head toward the doctor, and incidentally toward the other 9. I shouldn't have done it only. Well, I trust you will not regret my taking her. As I said before, you'll find her very nice. She is a widow. Her name is Mrs. Chapman. I'm sure you will like her. The doctor smothered a groan in his napkin. I haven't a doubt of it, he said maliciously. That was on Monday. The new boarder came Tuesday morning, and the 10 bachelors saw her for the first time the next night at dinner. She sat at the left of the landlady, and whenever they could do with impunity, they stole furtive glances in her direction and registered mental comments on the newcomer's general appearance and deportment. After dinner, they met in the doctor's room to talk her over. She was decidedly good-looking. That was one point in her favor. She was graceful and self-possessed. That was another. She listened with becoming interest to whatever they might have to say, and that was a third consideration that indicated that she was possessed of unusually sound common sense and entitled her to high standing in their good graces. The doctor was the first to pick a flaw. She strikes us as being a pretty good sort of person as women go, he said cynically. But the fact is, we've all got to be careful. I could read that woman like a book, and I tell you that in spite of her demure, grave exterior, she's sly, devilish sly. Widows always are. I don't know what makes them so, but I never yet knew one who couldn't hoodwink 9 out of 10 men she ever clapped eyes on. My experience has been that a woman don't let one husband grow cold before she's on the lookout for another. And I'll wager a box of cigars that before the new boarder has been here a fortnight, she will be after us tooth and toenail. The utmost caution on our part will be necessary. I, for one, am not ready to be roped in yet. They registered an ironclad oath of celibacy, and the next evening they set about to cultivate her acquaintance. She was not an extraordinary woman in any sense of the term, but for all that, she unconsciously drew men to her. She worked in a downtown bookstore for the day, and in the evening she sung a little, played a little, taught a little, and displayed her various accomplishments, all of which savored of the amateur, with a guilelessness that fairly took away the breath of her fellow boarders. At the end of the first week, they were more firmly convinced than ever that the widow was making a dead set at them, and again they vehemently declared that they wouldn't be taken in. She had been there a month before they committed themselves by any little acts of gallantry beyond the common courtesies attendant upon the friendship formed in the parlor. She seemed to be strangely alone and friendless in the city, and at last they concluded it was time for somebody around the house to show her some special attention. They played cards to see who it should be, and the duty devolved upon the doctor. Trilby was then running through its first week, and he took her to see the play. There was a lull in their conversation between the second and third acts, and he twisted around in the seat till her pretty face was brought more clearly into view, and then he said abruptly, "Men who contemplate matrimony are fools. They should be like me. I never intend to marry." Her face flushed under his close scrutiny. "No," she answered calmly. "Perhaps you are right. When men reach your age, they are generally pretty firmly set in their ways, and whether your decision is wise or not, you will not be apt to change your opinion unless—" She looked at him with an arch smile. For the first time in his life, the allusion to his age smote a chord that jarred painfully on the doctor's sensitive temperament, and the conditional unless assumed a tenfold greater significance than she had intended it to convey. He understood the import thoroughly, and when the curtain rose again, he stroked his mustache with an air of self-satisfaction and flattered himself that although she was devilish sly and had evidently set a deep trap for him, she had found her match. For 55 years, 40 of which had been chiefly spent in thwarting the schemes of wily women, had not been lived in vain. On the whole, he was very glad he had told her that he never meant to marry. It would make his conduct wholly open and above board, and his resistance against her attacks could be carried on with unconcealed weapons. The next Sunday, she fell to the hands of the bank cashier. Again the joys of single life were painted for her in glowing colors, and before the end of another week, every man at 465 had given her to understand delicately but clearly that while they all liked her and were willing to devote a little time to her now and then, any effort to drag them into a matrimonial net would be energy sadly misdirected. The widow always smiled after such confidential talks and smoothed out the folds of her black dress with an air of exceeding wisdom. During the month that followed, after the doctor first broke the ice and took her out, invitations to attend this thing and that thing were plentiful, and the occupant of Mrs. Haddock's back parlor cannot justly complain of dullness. Before offering to act as her escort, they always played cards to determine who should be the luckless cavalier, and 3 times out of 4, the finger of fate pointed out the doctor. At the end of 6 weeks, he asked her to marry him. She pulled down one corner of her veil, and at the same time tried to conceal the ghost of a smile that played round her lips. "I am surprised," she said at length, "greatly surprised. I thought you never intended to marry." "I thought so myself," he said with a sigh, "but men of my age are not so set in their ways as you imagine. They are always apt to stumble across someone less, you know." She smiled again. "Are you willing to wait a week for your answer?" she asked. "A month," he replied magnanimously, "if only I may hope that it will be favorable." Before Saturday night, the bank cashier and 2 others had proposed, and all were put on a week's probation. On Sunday, another boarder came. He sat opposite the window at dinner, and the landlady, whose bright brown head seemed to have been drawn through the dust of humiliation from some unknown cause, introduced him as Mr. Chapman. He was evidently a confirmed invalid, but for all that, the 10 bachelors could not help but admit to themselves that Mrs. Chapman had a very fine-looking brother-in-law. The doctor cleared out his throat 2 or 3 times, and took the liberty to tell her so when all except the newcomer, who had retired to the back parlor, had sought comfort on the large shady porch. The widow looked around on the 10 bachelors compassionately. "You were mistaken in the relationships," he said serenely. "He is not my brother-in-law, but my husband." The 10 men gasped. The doctor was the first to find his voice. "I thought," he commenced, glaring at her dumbly. "I know you did," she interrupted sweetly. "Perhaps I should have undeceived you, but when I saw how the land lay, I thought it would be just as well to let matters drift along as they would. None of you ever intended to marry, you know." She went into the back parlor, and the 10 bachelors groaned. The landlady felt that it devolved upon her to offer an explanation. I'm afraid the whole muddle is directly traceable to my assertion that she was a widow, she said contritely. She didn't tell me so, but from her being alone and working for a living and dressing in such deep mourning, I naturally inferred that such was the case. It seems she wears black for her mother who has recently died. Her husband has been ill for years, and alas it has become necessary for her to work. I am very sorry I am responsible for such an error. But after all, I think she is a very nice sort of a woman. She always tells her husband everything she says. Again the 10 bachelors writhed, both in body and spirit. At last the doctor got up and faced his small audience. We can't blame you, Mrs. Haddock, he said bitterly. No doubt she is a fine woman. But don't you remember, gentlemen, what I said that first night she was here? Didn't I say she is as tricky as they make 'em, and that we would have to be constantly on our guard? Didn't I say just that, and isn't she sly? The bank cashier smiled lugubriously at the memory of the past 2 months' experience with the new boarder. Yes, he assented, devilishly sly. This article originally came from the Chicago News. This story came from the great state of Pennsylvania, being reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer of September 29, 1895. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.